Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Last Trumpet Bible School. As you could see, today we are dealing with the topic of the atonement. We are doing the sixth lecture in this series, studies in the atonement, with a particular emphasis today on the principles in the Levitical sacrifices. Now, it's very important because there is a lot of misunderstanding around what actually happened. The way I was taught was that apparently, hands are laid on animals as a transfer of guilt, and then that animal dies in your stead. And we want to find out whether that was in actual fact the correct interpretation. Now, I will give you some reference about study material, but one of the most authoritative that I can recommend is a book by Milgren, which is a commentary on the book of Leviticus. He spent about 30 years on the study of the Levitical priesthood and the blood rituals of the ancient Hebrews. And so that is not the only one, but I find it very informative and authoritative. As a matter of fact, he's generally recognized as the most authoritative in terms of the sacrificial system. So what we want to do is to establish why there was blood, whether the emphasis was on the death of the animal or the actual blood presented, what is important to understand, and why that whole sacrificial system operated for so long, and how does that link to Christ. So let's begin. I think one of the most important scriptures to understand comes from Leviticus 17 verse 11, almost right in the middle of that book. I'm going to read for you. In Leviticus 17:11, it's one of the most central and misunderstood verses in all of Torah. It's often interpreted through later theological lenses, especially penal substitution. But a careful linguistic and cultural analysis from an ancient Hebrew perspective, particularly the honor, shame, purity, holiness worldview, reveals something much deeper. And this is where I want to get to. Again, referring you to the works of people like Milgren, who wrote extensively on the book of Leviticus. Let's look at it quickly. The literal translation from the Hebrew, which I try to give you here, would read as follows. For the life, or the nephesh of the flesh, is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your lives. For it is the blood that makes atonement through the life. Can you see how that ends? It's the blood that makes atonement through the life. And if you read Hebrew and actually understand what you read, then the Hebrew at the top will confirm to you that that is in actual fact the literal translation from the Hebrew. And that changes a lot of our understanding, which we are now going to elaborate on. But let's go further. First and foremost, we want to see that the life and the blood is connected. The life is in the blood. Let's just look at it. It's a Hebrew word nephesh, which is soul or living being. The life of that being is in the blood. And we need to understand what role blood plays in the Old Testament. Now, folks, I just want to interrupt myself quickly. What is it that we want to determine? You see, traditionally, there's a view that was developed particularly under Calvinism, that there is this retributive justice that had to be poured out on the Lord Jesus Christ. And obviously that principle is somehow drawn, somehow I say, from the Old Testament into the New. And so we have to understand if that's true. We have to understand how does that differ from pagans appeasing their deity. I hope you heard that correctly. Because in paganism, they have to bring sacrifices to appease an angry God. And in that sense, without trying to be disrespectful to people who hold that view, we are actually saying exactly the same thing. God is angry. God must be appeased. His wrath must be appeased. But we have a problem because some claim under this belief system that wrath is an attribute of God. Well, if it's an attribute, it's never going to go away. Just think about that. Anyway, so his wrath must be appeased. And that basically boils down to being almost exactly the same as what pagans believe. Or is there maybe something we misunderstand? And the misunderstanding lies exactly in what the sacrificial system did and what it meant. And that's why we talk about it today. God willing, we'll carry on next week because it's quite an extensive study. The first point we then find and in relation to this statement is that nephesh, or life and blood, is connected. So in ancient Hebrew, nephesh refers to the entire life force, often represented physically by blood or breath. Blood or breath. In other words, life and blood connected. It's precious. God is the giver of life. Okay? And so we see nephesh can mean a person, also 70 souls, you remember that. Anyway, blood is not symbolic of punishment, but is vital life. Let's look at it. You see, in the culture of the modern Western world, blood and gruesomeness and death and torture goes hand in hand, and it skews our understanding of what blood meant to be in the Bible. Okay? So in the view of the ancient Hebrew culture, blood meant life, not punishment. Let's establish that. To offer blood is to offer life. Now remember what was offered. What was taken into most holy place? Blood. It was life taken in. It represented the whole life force of that animal. Okay? To offer blood is to offer life, and therefore one's honor and identity to God. So to offer blood is to offer the whole being. When it comes to Christ, who offers blood, is to offer everything he is to the Father, because it represents all that he is, his whole life force, if you can use it in that sense. Number two, the life is in the blood. In the blood. Let's see this, what it means. The life is in the blood, not because of some mystical power, but because blood is the carrier of vitality. And we need to demystify misunderstandings. Because Christians love to say, I under the blood, but they don't know what they mean. We pray the covering of the blood, that you get where? It's not even a biblical principle, and you don't even understand what it means as a Christian. So in the biblical Hebrew understanding of it, it doesn't have any sort of mystical power meaning. It has a direct connection to life. Anyway, ancient Israelites viewed blood as sacred, not because it was magical, but because it belonged to God. You see, life comes from God, and it belongs therefore to him. And we're going to see something very interesting under the Levitical the Levirate laws. What was required if you even kill an animal for food? We'll see how sacred this blood is. And I want to establish it firm in your minds that life does not, the blood does not represent punishment, but life. Again, our culture has connected gruesomeness and death and murder and slaughter and all types of violence to blood. But to God it's sacred. He gave that life. The vitality is carried in that blood, and it must be given back to him because he's the God of life, the God of the living. Anyway, let's go further. Let me now make this very clear. The life is in the blood, and the blood was given to you. You see, just in this verse, there's such a profound insight. The blood on the altar is God's gift, not humanity's offering to appease him. Think about that. The Lord says, I give you this blood to make atonement. Now, if we apply the word atonement correctly, as it was intended initially in the English language, is to make at one mint. That means there is separation because of uncleanness, and blood bringing life will make at one with God again. Take note, it's not something we bring to God, it's something God gives to us to bring us back to Himself. Did you see that? Small little word, but we miss it. It's, I have given to you, in the same manner that He gives the Son to reconcile us back to Himself. And we're going to elaborate on this blood just now. Hang in there. I've given it to you. Blood is not offered to change God, but used by God to restore relationship. You see, God doesn't change, but we are separated. Sin brings uncleanness, and uncleanness needs to be washed away. Therefore, we read throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, not blood appeases, but the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all unrighteousness. Have you ever noticed that? Go and look at the book of John, 1 John for example. The blood cleanses, not appease, because its function in the Old Testament, particularly when it gets to the Levitical sacrifices, is to cleanse away uncleanness, and it's never changed. Okay? Now, in ancient covenant culture, the offended party grants a means of reconciliation, which is what he then gives. The life is in the blood. You give the life to him, and it brings a cleansing and a reconciliation. Okay? We're going to look at it just now. And it's upon the altar. Now, what does that mean? I've given you I've given you this blood upon the altar. Now, that's interesting. The altar is the zone of divine human interaction. There always had to be a place where God meets man. In this case, it's blood upon the altar. And what we'll see in the New Testament, Christ is our mercy seat. What is the mercy seat? It's the place where God meets man. But He embodies that place. He's the place where God meets man. Do you understand how significant that is? And it's not the blood of goats and bulls that He applies, but His own blood. He brings His whole life, and bringing His whole life to the Father, He mediates between man and God, and He personally becomes the place where God meets man. How profound is that? And so, nothing in the Word is for nothing. It's there for a purpose, to point us to Christ. So He's given us this as this place where man meets God, and a place where holy and profane touch. And we're going to now dig into this shortly. Very, very interesting. Blood is not a substitute punishment, but a cleansing and sanctifying agent in the Hebrew culture. Do you get that? It's not something for punishment, but it's something in the Hebrew culture seen as something that cleanses, and something required to maintain sacred space. Don't dismay, I'm going to explain that now, and it's very important for you to understand. Folks, once we've got what the blood rituals was about in the Old Testament, I must warn you, you'll be ruined for the wrong atonement theory. Because then we can apply it correctly as far as Christ is concerned. And He's given the blood to kippur. Kippur, what does it mean? To atone is the English, but the meaning is to cover, to cleanse, to purge, or reconcile. That comes out of not my words, but the dictionary on the Hebrew language of the Old Testament. It means to cover, cleanse, purge, and reconcile. Do you even read the word appease there? You see, folks, what we need to get in the back of our minds, God calls out a people for Himself. Then He covenants with them, and He gives the conditions of that relationship through the law and the bylaws. Then He does that so that He could bring His presence into their midst, because His desire was from the beginning to dwell with man. But should they violate those principles and defile that which is sacred, so that his presence withdraws, he has placed a means there so that it could be prevented. And what is that? Let's look at the order. He covenants, he gives the conditions, then he institutes the temple and the sacrificial system and the priesthood. And they were there not to appease wrath, but to maintain presence. Because his desire was to have relationship and to dwell in the midst of his people, and the blood served to cleanse, not appease, so that he could stay there. Okay? And we need to understand that, because somehow we got it all wrong. Nowhere in the whole book of Leviticus, and I challenge you to show me, do we read any sort of institution where the Lord says, I am now angry to the point of killing you all, and if you don't bring a sacrifice to appease my wrath, then I'm going to kill you. It doesn't exist, nowhere. Further, it's to make atone, it's to cleanse, ransoming a person from a judgment. What does that mean? There are consequences, because in the Western mind, when we read judgment, we think, okay, now he's going to kill us. We have to appease him. What you have to understand is it defiles, sin defiles. The presence of the Lord is withdrawn. Then he would deal with them in a particular way, still to bring them back, not to destroy them. Because guess what? Just to prove that point, there were certain sins for which sacrifice could not be brought, people had to be killed. So if sacrifice was to redeem people from the punishment of death, why were there death penalties which could not be reversed in the Old Testament? There was no sacrifice that you could bring. You had to be stoned or killed. Do I make sense? You see, people have misinterpreted the scriptures, and then they misinterpret the work of the atonement. Let's just go back, sorry. So, there is no such an idea relayed here as not to punish the animal instead of the person. It wasn't a system of punishment, but purify what is polluted and reunite what was separated. That is the core of the sacrificial system. Now let me show you. Jacob Milgram, in his book Commentary on Leviticus, says, blood is the essence of life and belongs not to humans but to God. Hence, they must eschew the blood, drain it and return it, as it were, to the Creator. It's all holy. It doesn't represent death. It represents life. Now, I prefer to believe Jacob Milgram, because he's a real Jew who studied this for 30 years and made some very authoritative comments on it. And if you actually read his book, you will find that throughout he makes it very clear. There's nothing linked to appeasement of wrath. That is a misrepresentation. Now, let's understand something. You see, part of the sacrificial system is the actual killing of the animal. But we have a few problems with killing of animals. And I know most of us in Christianity were not taught these things. We just glibly brush over it and we don't understand what it really means. Okay. As far as Torah is concerned, there is no such a thing as a substitutionary death sacrifice. Again, go read Milgram, and then I'll give you a few others that I've studied on this particular topic at the end of the session. The hand-laying ritual is not saying this is me, this is my substitute, but rather this is mine. I owe this and I'm giving it to God. And that's for various distinct purposes. It's acknowledgement of ownership. This is mine, I give it to you. Not, this is my sin, I now transfer it. The only instance where sin is transferred onto an animal is with the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and that is on a goat, by the way, not a lamb, and that goat is let to go into the wilderness. According to tradition, of course, we know later they shoved them off a cliff or whatever because the goat came back. But that is also not necessarily, it's more apocryphal than anything else, if I can use that word. Further, Sacrificial slaughter is itself not focused on the biological death on the animal. Sacrificial slaughter is separated from any notion of simply being a death, and it is explicitly reconceptualized via specific rituals. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, folks, I'm going to show you something that you might not have known. Okay? Number one, if, according to Levirate laws, if you killed something, you are defiled. If you touch something that's dead, you're defiled. If you killed something, you're defiled. If you killed something, if you killed an animal without bringing its blood back to the Lord as sacred, and you just killed it, guess what? You've committed a transgression and you could be killed. It was constituted a murder. Did you know that? According to the Bible, not according to me. I'll show you in the book. So it was not about a death. If you just merely killed an animal, it was just in the death, you could be accused of recklessly just killing something. You see, what's changed? You see, here we have a priest who actually kills something. According to the Levitical law, he should not go near the temple. But the death was not the focus. What was the focus? The focus was the blood. The focus was not killing the animal, but extracting the blood and bringing the blood as a life gift to God, because life comes from Him. You give life back to Him. And that would have various applications. But the main thing is it would cleanse that which was now defiled. And I'm going to explain some very important understandings about the sacrificial blood. So sacrificial slaughter itself is not the focus. The biological death is not the focus. Do you understand what that means when it comes to Christ? Because as some people, as far as some are concerned, something has to die. I'm guilty of sin, I have to die. So kill him. Is that the focus of the atonement, the death? Or according to the Levitical process, if the death was meaningless and the blood is not brought to God, that death is a murder. The blood must be brought to the Lord because it has a restitutive purpose. Can you see what I'm saying? There's a link. So even in the Old Testament, if they just killed, killing was not enough. It would actually anger the Lord. The sacrifice of the blood, the ritual of the blood, is what kept everything pure. So if the priest killed with the purpose of sanctifying everything by bringing the lifeblood, then the killing that he committed is not a sin, and therefore he is not defiled, and he stays clean. The blood cleansed. Do you see what I'm trying to show? The blood cleansed. Nowhere in the story was about appeasing anyone. Sacrificial slaughter is not at all about making the animal suffer. I had a man send me a letter telling me, they kicked the goat and they did this and they did that from the rabbinical writings. I'm not interested in extra biblical literature. The Lord deemed that whole sacrificial process sacred. And according to the scriptures, which is my reference and not extra biblical literature, it had to be kept that way. Everything is sacred. The Lord treasures that life. The life is brought. It's about life, not about punishment. What people did in their fallen state is their problem. I can't use that as gospel. Okay. If substitutionary death was the logic of animal sacrifice, then the one thing we could expect to be remedied by sacrifice would be capital offenses, when the death of the offender is on the line. But yet we find people sent to death. So sacrificial death cannot be the answer. Am I clear? Sorry, I had to stipulate that clearly. Now, you can look at the Lamb of the Free, recovering the varied sacrificial understandings of the death of Christ, and Andrew Remington and Rillera wrote that book. It's unbelievable and I can highly recommend it. But let's make that clear. Now let's look at the scriptures. So death cannot be brought into a sacred space without defiling it. There are the scriptures. Not only can death itself not be brought into sacred space, but also nothing and no one associated with death via ritual impurity can be brought into sacred spaces. Okay? So what is the reason I'm showing you these scriptures? Just to underline the point that it cannot be about a death. I almost want to say death is coincidental to extracting that blood and bringing it. And why a death? Because it's a surrender of the whole life. Why not just make a cut and bring blood? Well, the death implies the surrender. I'm giving my whole life, my whole being, my whole life force in that sense. If any one of the house of Israel slaughtered an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or slaughtered it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, he shall be held guilty of bloodshed. You just kill it to eat, but you didn't bring the blood. It's bloodshed. He has shed blood, and he shall be cut off from the people. Did you know that? You can't just kill it. Life was so sacred to the Lord. The life blood was so sacred. You even had to bring what you needed to eat. To acknowledge the preciousness of life and God as the giver of life, you had to bring that to him. Now that should tell you something about blood. It's got nothing to do with punishment, but everything with life. So when his son comes to him and offers his own blood, he's offering his own life as an reconciliation, as a permanent cleansing of anything that could stand between us and God. Because there's something else that you now need to understand. The implication clearly, I want to read again for you from Lamb of the Free. The implication clearly is that in the post-slaughter ritual that are central to the act of atonement. In other words, it's not about the slaughter, it's what is done afterwards that sanctifies everything. Okay? This does not square well with the idea that the sacrifice atones via substitution. If you just kill it, it won't substitute. It's the blood. Guys, am I making the point clear enough? And I'm sorry I'm laboring it a little bit, but we have such a deep engraved mindset of misinterpreting this particular understanding, especially when it comes to Christ. This does not square well with the idea that the sacrifice atones via substitution, because in the idea of substitution, the death of the animal in place of the author is the focus. But the Lord calls this, you are guilty of bloodshed. Okay? In this substitution of the animal for the offerer were the key to the understanding of the whole act. Why would the ritual performed after the slaughter be identified specifically as what atones? It's not the animal. It's not the killing. It's the ritual afterwards. Did you get that? See, there's so many people say, yes, he died for us. And what about his resurrection? What about what he did according to the book of Hebrews, offering his own blood as a high priest? What about that part? You see, you miss that when you try and hammer penal substitution in as the be-all and wherewithal of atonement. Now, so what atones is blood. Moreover, why would not the priest do the slaughtering? Good point. A bloodless breaking of the animal's neck or some such would suffice as a sacrifice if all that matters was the death of the animal. Now, let us understand further. So we started off with Leviticus 17. We emphasized the importance of blood and what is really meant by blood. Totally delivered from a Western understanding of gruesomeness and death and destruction, hate and wrath and all these things that we connect to it via Hollywood. Thank you. Okay, and then we look at the Hebrew culture and we understand, whoa, this is something sacred. Offering blood is what God gave us as a means to get back to him. It's he who took the initiative once again. And why blood? How does that differ from the pagan? You see, simple, because God is the author of life. He gives life. The blood represents life, and the offering of the blood represents the whole life of that animal. Totally, unreservedly. But it then does something. Anything that might have defiled is now cleansed away. Then we emphasize the fact that it is not in the death, because according to the book of Leviticus, just killing an animal is seen as a murder. What actually makes it count and that sanctifies both the priest and the sacrifice is the bringing of blood. Blood taken in, because the emphasis is on life, not death or appeasement. Right? Now comes a very important understanding. In the light of all of this, we now go back to our previous statement where we say, look, God calls a people, He then covenants with them, He then gives them the conditions of maintaining His presence amongst them. Then He institutes the priesthood, a sacrificial system, and a place where that sacrifice must be brought in order to maintain His presence. Got that? To maintain His presence. Now what He did was, in order to bring His presence into the camp, we now have to understand the difference between the sacred and the profane. Now, if we use our modern language profane, we think it's something vulgar, disgusting, and scabrous. Okay? But this is not the meaning. You see, as far as the Bible is concerned, we need to look at the definition there. That which is holy and sacred is that which is set apart for the service of the Lord specifically. That which is profane is not necessarily something sinful, but something that is ordinary, day to day, not sacred, holy, and dedicated to the Lord's service alone. So you had the temple and the priests as holy and sacred, and then you had the people outside who were busy with their day-to-day lives as the profane. There was a difference. Then you had the clean and the unclean. Okay? So you have holy, sacred, and profane, clean, and unclean. There are 4 categories. Now, something can be holy and clean, or holy and unclean. If it's holy or dedicated to the Lord, but there's some uncleanness, the uncleanness needs to be eradicated. Not by some way of retributive justice because there's wrath. But what grieves away the presence, or what could cause the Lord to depart from the people with all the consequences that would then follow, that had to be eradicated. And the blood that cleanses, you see, sin brought uncleanness. Please, folks, go and read for yourself the link between blood and cleansing, and show me one verse between blood and appeasement. Doesn't exist. Okay? And so let's see, now we have these categories, and once we understand the categories, we can now apply where the blood functions. Again, folks, the blood explicitly functions here to maintain the presence of the Lord, to clean what is unclean, to reconcile all the time. Now let's read quickly. So we had the holy, which is the set apart or distinct, refers to what belongs to God or is dedicated to His purpose. And then we had the common or the unholy or the profane. That was ordinary, not set apart, does not mean sinful, just not sacred. So in Bible terms, when they would call anyone profane, it doesn't mean they were sinful. It just meant they weren't of the priestly order or part of the temple sacrificial system or anything else that then was dedicated to the Lord. So you have the sacred, of course, that's another word. It belongs to the vine. And then you have the profane also, which is all, belongs to the ordinary world. And that's what we need to see. There's the divine and the ordinary world mixing together. And God always desired to dwell in the midst of His people. Now, unclean and clean. Unclean could be impure and polluted. Incompatible with sacred spaces, not always sinful. So you could be unclean but not sinful. And I mean, I don't want to go into that today, but you need to understand that, body fluids, etc., made people unclean. They could not get into sacred spaces. So what had to happen? Sacrifice. Cleansing, all the time cleansing. If we understand that, and we understand the way that the sacrificial system was set up and how it maintained relationship, things might become clear to us. The blood, the life of it, is something God gave. The emphasis was never on the death of an animal to appease God, but the bringing of life to cleanse and to draw back the presence of the Lord. Okay, now, Let's go further. I've just quickly explained the cultural meaning here. So something which was holy or kadosh, um, it could not be approached casually or in an unprepared state. Doing so was dangerous. See, the presence was there and it was an all-consuming fire. You can't get near it, you had to be clean. Like, for example, the high priest who went in once a year into most holy place, but blood was applied first, not to appease an angry God, but to cleanse the man who approaches. Okay? Guys, am I coming through? Is it clear? Now, so it required ritual preparation through blood. Okay? That which was profane, without special honor, was not evil, simply not elevated. However, treating sacred things as common was a grave insult to God. So you don't mix with sacred things because it's dedicated to his service. Okay? And we read in Ezekiel 22:26 that the priest was supposed to help to the people to discern between the holy and unholy, the sacred and the profane. Now, the unclean, of course, that which was impurity isn't necessarily sinful, but it's incompatible with God's holy presence. So everything revolves around his presence. Do you see? When we go to the Old Testament, the categories, it's all around his presence. Okay? So ancient thought impurity symbolized disorder, mortality, and human vulnerability. And thus we read in Leviticus 15:31, thus you shall separate the Israelites from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle. Can you see what he's saying? So people who committed sin in the camp defiled everything, because typically in that culture, which is a honor shame, covenantal, bigger extended family culture, one brings a shame in, it shames all. But one brings a shame in, they bring defilement in the camp. There are many such examples in the Old Testament. And defilement causes the presence of God to lift. So in order to prevent that, there had to be a cleansing. Guess what? But if there was a sin unto death, sacrifice wouldn't work. That should tell you something. Okay? Again, sorry, I just have to repeat that. We understand clearly that if the death of an animal was substitutionary, that the man doesn't have to die, why was there capital punishment for which no sacrifice could be brought? Anyway, so the clean, of course, was that which was honorable. Let's just summarize it quickly. So holy was highest honor, dedicated and set apart. So it's central and dangerous if misused. It was there was divine glory and the presence of God was there. Then the common or the profane was neutral, not set apart, outside the sacred boundary, and ordinary everyday. Very easy to understand. Then the clean or the pure was honorably prepared, fit for participation, allowed access, order, life, and readiness. So in other words, amongst that which was common or profane, the people had to be clean. If they were unclean, they were unfit and they can't go to the presence. It's actually so easy once you put it out like that. And then, what was God's provision? For that simple reason, there was a sacrificial system, and we're going to look at this, God willing, in the next session. So, the sanctuary symbolizes the presence of God. That temple, right? Impurity represented the wrongdoing of persons. If persons unremittingly polluted the sanctuary, they forced God out of his sanctuary and out of their lives. And that is again by Jacob Milgram. Then further, the source of holiness is assigned to God alone. Holiness is the extension of God's nature. It is the agency of God's will. If certain things are termed holy, such as the land, persons or priests, a place, the sanctuary, or time, a holy day, they are to so by virtue of this divine dispensation. In other words, God declared it holy. He set it apart for himself. Moreover, this designation is always subject to recall. He could withdraw from that. He could change it. It's not permanent. Israel is also commanded to distinguish between the holy and the common, as well as between the pure and the impure. Again, from Jacob Milgram in the book of Leviticus. So what is important? We have here a number of quotations from authorities on the subject who makes it very clear that this whole sacrificial system was for the maintaining of relationship, with the focus on bringing that which is unclean to a state of cleanness, so that they could be prepared to enter in to the presence of the Lord. There were two groups of sacrifices. The one group was those whole burnt offerings, whether that was animal or grains or whatever spices was burnt. It was consumed completely, and those were pleasant fragrances unto the Lord. On the other side, there were the reconciling sacrifices, the atoning sacrifices. And now I'll drop something on you that you need to think about, because we're going to elaborate on it very much. When the people brought atoning sacrifices to cleanse for their sins, they were never allowed to participate or eat of it. But when there was an offering brought to the Lord, for which there was a celebration of life, a celebration of wellness, the people could eat of it. Now I'm asking you, in the light of their tradition and the light of the sacrificial system, did the people not get an instruction from the Lord to eat of the sacrifice? Which should tell you the sacrifice that Christ brought was a well-being sacrifice, to bring the people into a place that could be true of what the angel said. Peace on earth and goodwill towards men. So we're going to unravel that a little bit later. I just want to leave that with you. Think about it. Any sacrifice that was atoning in the Old Testament could not be eaten by the one who brought the sacrifice. But there are different sacrifices from which the people could eat. For example, the Passover lamb. And what does it mean? You see, folks, what I'm trying to do is just to get you to think, so that once we set out the different sacrifices and the application of that within the framework of maintaining relationship, you can start to see what can and what cannot be. We need to ask questions. If it's true that you can't eat the atoning sacrifice for your own sin, then how does that work when we eat the flesh and drink the blood of the lamb? Doesn't it somehow violate a scriptural principle and is contrary to it? And we need to think, and we're going to get there. I'm just leaving that deliberately right there. So now, let's just look quickly. We've looked at the blood. We've looked at the emphasis on blood and not death. We've looked at the different categories within the nation of Israel and how they relate to God, and what was required to bring them back into relationship. And now we see something else. Now, as far as the individual was concerned, the individual relationship to the sacred space is clearly defined. So an Israelite's goal was to live in the state of cleanness and approach God in holiness. But life constantly risked defilement. So that could be touching the dead, bodily discharges, childbirth, skin disease, unintentional sin, breaking covenantal boundaries. Each of these required a specific sacrificial response to restore. Nowhere to appease. Man, I just get worked up. So there are scriptures that I've just set it out for you that you can go and read. The different sources of uncleanness and the sacrifices that had to be brought. The idea is that I quickly make a comment on that, because again we're running a little bit out of time. In ancient Hebrew, we can conclude purity was about proximity to God. The holy must not be contaminated by the unclean. The tabernacle as sacred space had to be protected from impurity, lest God's presence depart or destroy. That does not mean it appeases. It had to be kept pure. Sin had to be eradicated. It had to be cleansed. Okay? The impurity laws taught Israel to live in constant awareness of God's holiness, the fragility of life, and their dependent identity as a sanctified people. Okay? Why would God's presence consume? We know the Lord is a consuming fire. That which is unclean will be consumed and will be consumed in the end. You know that fire that it talks about? That there's only one everlasting fire. That fire that consumes. The Lord himself will consume everything that's unclean and not dedicated unto him and cleansed by blood. And so we see this notion here in the Old Testament that we can follow through right into the New Testament. Now, let me just quickly say the following. So there's uncleanness that defiles us, it takes away from the presence. And then there's sin, obviously. That in the Hebrew language is literally to miss the mark, to break the covenant, or to violate divine order. Okay? So it's a relational breach against God. Let's just get that. It's a relational breach. They already stand in the relationship. Rooted in the verb hata, it means to miss the target. Sin is an offense against God's holiness, a disruption of covenantal fidelity, and often a shameful betrayal of identity and calling. Now there is a way to deal with that. So you get unintentional sin, you get high-handed sin, and you get covenantal disloyalty. The Bible broke it up in 3 categories. So it's unintentional, and then one deliberate one, and then breaking of covenantal loyalty. And so what we'll see as we go on with our study is this is where we now need to focus and understand what those sacrifices did. So what I want to leave with you, I don't want to go further than this because the rest is now going into those sacrifices, which God willing we will take on next week. What I want to make very clear is that we've got defilements which people normally can't help for, but then we get to sin, and this is where your interest must now be alerted, because obviously this is where various types of atoning sacrifices comes in. But we want to determine whether you even see the idea of wrath here, of appeasement, of a demand for a death, or what was sacrificed and why, and how does it speak to the 3 different categories of sin. So we see ancient Israel understood human life not as autonomous moral individuals, but as participants in a sacred ecosystem that must be constantly purified and guarded. See, that links up with the idea of what God said to Adam. You guard and keep the garden. It was a sacred space. You guard it, you keep it. Sin disrupts relationship, covenantal, ethical, and moral. Impurity disrupts sacred proximity, ritual, spatial, and social. Sacrifice washing rituals were God's gracious tools to restore individuals to wholeness, not to punish but to repair. The ultimate goal was always that I may dwell in their midst. Guys, let's just get that. So far, so good. I'm trying to give you a condensed version of approximately 1,500 pages of comments on the book of Leviticus. And I can tell you, it's so interesting when you study with the real scholars on this topic, you will discover that there's no way that they can disagree. So I just want to, as promised, quickly get to a resource here that I can show you. So Jacob Milgram's book on Leviticus is definitely the one book you can look at. Then one that is quite authoritative that I can highly recommend is a book by James Greenberg, who's also another Jewish scholar. His book is titled A New Look at Atonement in Leviticus. A New Look at Atonement in Leviticus. Then I just want to get another one. One that is also very interesting is Andrew Bonar, which is a commentary on the book of Leviticus. Andrew Bonar. And then probably one of my favorite books is The Lamb of the Free by Andrew Remington Rilera, which is quite authoritative. It goes extensively into the language, um, and it's very insightful if you are interested in a more academical approach to this topic. I'm trying to reduce it to something that's consumable for everybody, but there I do have much deeper studies on this topic. The point that I wanted to make for this morning as far as atonement is concerned, understanding the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system and the blood rites of the ancient Hebrews is critical. Why was it given? Where does it apply? And my hope for today was to make it very clear that it's already within covenant relationship, that the blood was given for the maintenance of that relationship. The emphasis was never on a death. Just killing something constituted a murder. The emphasis was on the blood ritual after the sacrifice. Otherwise, everything would be impure. And the blood sacrifice emphasis was on the presentation of life. And that life, as far as God was concerned and why He gave it, would eradicate or cleanse and purge uncleanness so that relationship could be restored. The emphasis being that God gave that blood. God gave it. I gave it as a means of atonement to make at one. Because obviously sin defiles, sin brings death. Blood cleanses and blood banishes death. And that's what is important. It was never on a mere killing. Because if it was, as I've pointed out, you could just break the animal's neck and then God would be happy. But it had nothing to do with that. But the question is, why a death? Well, simply because extracting the blood, the whole lifeblood, represented the whole of the life and being and life force of that animal. And that then points us to the one who would come, who would give it as a well-being offering for one, not the only, but for one, and give the people to participate in it. Then we are left with questions. We are going to have to look at, as far as we understand now, the four categories, the sacred and the profane, the clean and the unclean, and we understand how blood operates there to maintain closeness. But then as far as sins are concerned, we look at the deliberate sins, the intentional sins. Those are unintentional and covenantal breaking, and which sacrifices do apply. Because if we somewhere in the atonement sacrifices for deliberate sins could find wrath, then penal substitution got a case. But if it's not there, we've got a problem of interpreting anything in the New Testament in such a manner, because this is what has traditionally been used. So God willing, we'll dig into that next week, and we will go much more into an understanding of the blood and blood rituals in the Old Testament. Amen.